Let me just say up front what this video is actually about, because I think the way most people cover Darcey Silva gets it slightly wrong. The conversation always ends up being, are the bags real or fake? And that's genuinely interesting, but it misses the bigger thing happening here. What I actually want to talk about is the architecture of a persona, how it gets built, why it's so hard to walk back, and what happens when the cost of maintaining it starts to outpace whatever it was supposed to protect. Darcy's situation, and Georgi's involvement in it, is one of the more uncomfortable examples of that I've seen on reality TV in a while. And I think it deserves more than just a gotcha, the shoes are fake, take. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to look at what's actually documented, what fans have pointed out over the years, what the show itself has aired, and what my honest read is on the whole thing. Some of this I'm confident about. Some of it is genuinely just my interpretation. I'll tell you which is which. One more thing before we get into it. I'm not here to be cruel about this. Darcy is a real person going through something that a lot of people go through privately, except hers is happening on television and on social media in front of millions of people. That's worth acknowledging. But I'm also not going to sugarcoat what the cameras have actually shown us, because I think that does her and the audience a disservice. All right, let's get into it. For anyone who needs a quick orientation, Darcey Silva has been part of the 90-Day universe for several years now, first appearing on Before the 90 Days with Jesse Meester and later with Tom Brooks, before eventually getting her own spin-off, Darcy and Stacey, which she shares with her twin sister. By the time Georgi Rusev entered the picture, Darcy had already become one of the more recognizable figures in the franchise's extended cast. She's built a following, she's built a brand, and she has been extremely deliberate about the image she presents publicly. That image is expensive looking. There's a specific aesthetic she's going for: Miami glamour, designer labels, high-rise living, the kind of lifestyle that reads as successful on Instagram in a very particular way. Red bottom heels, Cartier-adjacent jewelry, luxury handbags, the apartment that looks like a hotel lobby. She and Stacey have leaned into this together, and for a while it worked, at least on the surface. The show's audience bought into it enough to keep watching, and the persona became inseparable from who Darcy is as a television personality. Georgi, when he came along, fit into that aesthetic. He's European, he's polished in that certain way. He wore nice things. He presented himself as someone with means. Whether either of them had the actual financial substance to back up the image they were both projecting is where things get genuinely murky. Now, here's what I want to be careful about. I don't have access to either of their bank accounts. Nobody watching a YouTube video does. So when I say murky, I mean murky from what's been shown on the show, what's been said on camera, and what fans have pieced together from publicly observable details. None of that is definitive, but some of it is pretty telling. The designer question has been floating around in this fandom for years, and it didn't start with some random comment in a Reddit thread. It started because people who actually know luxury goods started paying attention to what Darcy was wearing on camera, and some of what they noticed didn't add up. The Louboutin situation is probably the most talked about example. Authentic Christian Louboutin shoes are known for their red lacquered soles, and that red is a specific shade applied in a specific way. There's a texture and a finish to it that's consistent across their products. Fans who follow the brand closely have pointed out over the years that some of the shoes Darcy has worn on the show didn't look quite right in that department. The color seemed off, the finish seemed thinner. And then there was the escalator moment. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. Darcy took a tumble on an escalator, which would be awkward for anyone, but what made it a lasting discussion point wasn't the fall itself. It was the footage afterward, where viewers who watched closely said the red on the soles appeared to chip or scrape in a way that real Louboutin lacquer typically doesn't. Genuine Louboutin red is durable in that specific sense. The community consensus, and I want to be clear, this is viewer observation and not a certified authentication, was that those particular shoes were knockoffs. Now, I wasn't there. I can't personally authenticate a shoe from a television clip, but I will say this. The reaction in the fan community wasn't a fringe thing. It was widespread, detailed, and came from people who had clearly spent time around the real items. And Darcy's response, or rather the absence of one, didn't do much to clear things up. The Cartier discussion follows a similar pattern. People have flagged the bracelets she and Stacey wear, suggesting they look more consistent with gold-plated replicas than solid gold or white gold pieces. Again, I can't verify that from a television screen. What I can say is that this isn't a one-time accusation. It's a recurring observation from multiple directions, and it stacks with everything else. Here's what I actually think is going on, and this is my read, not a confirmed fact. I think Darcy may have started buying some replica items specifically because she couldn't afford the real versions, but the persona required the appearance of the real versions. That's a trap that's very easy to fall into once you've committed to a certain image. You've told everyone, implicitly or explicitly, that you're at a certain level. Then you either spend money you don't have to actually be at that level, or you fake it. A lot of people choose the third option, which is to quietly scale back. Darcy, as far as I can tell, has not chosen that option. The financial stuff gets more complicated when you bring Georgi into it, because Georgi's own financial situation has been a recurring undercurrent on the show. What was actually aired is interesting. There were conversations on Darcy and Stacey about money, about who was contributing what, about Georgi's share of expenses, and the dynamic that came through, at least to me watching it, was not a picture of two financially stable adults splitting costs comfortably. It reads more like a negotiation between two people who both have more image than income, trying to figure out who owes what. The conversation that got a lot of attention was the one where Georgi and Florian were talking, and it came out that there were real concerns about Darcy's finances. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to misquote anyone or represent a scene as something it wasn't. What I can say is that the impression fans took away from certain conversations on the show was that Georgi didn't necessarily believe Darcy had the financial resources she projected, and that this was a source of tension. Whether that's a fair characterization of what was actually said, I genuinely encourage you to go back and watch those scenes yourself, rather than take my summary as gospel. Television editing does a lot of work, and I'm aware that what airs is a shaped version of what actually happened. What's harder to explain away is the Mike Silva situation. Mike Silva is Darcy and Stacey's father, and he's appeared on the show. He's clearly a presence in their lives, both emotionally and practically. And what came out, through the show's own footage and through discussions among fans who watched carefully, was that Mike was involved in financial conversations that arguably shouldn't require a parent's involvement when the children in question are adults in their 40s. The suggestion, from what was shown and discussed, was that Mike was helping to cover costs that Darcy couldn't cover on her own, including, reportedly, rent. I want to handle this carefully. There's nothing inherently shameful about family members helping each other financially. It happens, it's normal, and it doesn't make someone a bad person. What makes it a story in this specific context is the disconnect between the help being received and the image being projected. If you're posting photos of yourself with luxury goods and presenting yourself as a self-made boss babe who has figured it out, and at the same time your father is reportedly helping you keep the lights on, those two things are in direct conflict. And the tension between them is where I think a lot of Darcy's visible stress comes from. The rent dynamic is something a lot of fans have pointed to as particularly telling. Miami is an expensive city. The kind of apartment that reads as luxury on Instagram in Miami is not cheap. If Darcy's primary income is reality television checks and whatever she's making from her brand and social presence, there's a real question about whether that income supports the lifestyle she's maintaining in the way she implies it does. I'm not in a position to answer that, definitively. But I don't think I'm being unfair when I say the math, based on publicly available information, does not obviously add up. The TikTok live stuff is worth talking about because it adds another layer to this. Both Darcy and Georgi have done TikTok lives where fans can send virtual gifts, which translate into real money. That's a completely normal thing on the platform, and plenty of people do it without it meaning anything particularly significant about their finances. But the context matters. When you've built an entire brand around the idea that you're wealthy and thriving, and then your audience watches you spend significant time on a platform soliciting digital gifts from viewers who may have considerably less money than you're implying you have, that reads differently. It's not just a tactical choice, it's a signal. And fans picked up on that signal pretty quickly. Again, I'm not saying this is proof of anything. I'm saying it contributes to a pattern that people have been piecing together over time, and that the cumulative picture is worth taking seriously. I want to spend some time on Georgi specifically, because I think he's an easier target than he should be, and I also think he's sometimes given more credit than he deserves, and both of those things are happening simultaneously in different parts of this fandom. The easy critique of Georgi is that he was in this for money, and that once he realized Darcy didn't have what he thought she had, the relationship was never going to last. That might be partially true. I genuinely don't know what his motivations were or are. What I do know is that the show presented him as someone who was also invested in projecting a certain image, who also wore expensive-looking things that may or may not have been what they appeared to be, and who also participated in conversations about money in ways that didn't always reflect well on him. The Florian dynamic is interesting to me, and it's something I think gets underexamined. Florian Sukaj is Stacy's husband, and the four of them spend a lot of time together. The show has shown moments between Georgi and Florian that had a kind of easy camaraderie, and some of the moments that generated the most discussion among fans came from scenes involving all four of them. My honest read, watching the show over time, is that the dynamic between the two couples has been more complicated than either supportive family unit or everyone secretly hates each other. It's something messier, with genuine affection alongside real tension, and the financial stuff runs through all of it. What I will say about Georgi is that I think he's a person who made certain choices in this situation, and those choices didn't always look great. Choosing to maintain an image you can't sustain isn't unique to Darcy. He was doing it too. Now, let me take the other side of this, because I think intellectual honesty requires it. There's a version of this story where Darcey Silva is not a con artist or a fraud, but just someone who made some aspirational purchases, built a persona around a version of her life she was genuinely working toward, and got caught in the gap between where she was and where she wanted to be. That's not a flattering portrait either, but it's a more sympathetic one. And it's possible. People buy things they can't really afford. People project an image that's slightly ahead of where they actually are. That's not unique to Darcy. It's just that most people doing it aren't on television where fans can zoom in on the bottoms of their shoes. The scale of scrutiny she's under is genuinely unusual, and I think it's worth acknowledging that being this visible creates a kind of pressure that most people never have to deal with. There's also the question of whether everything fans have identified as fake actually is. I've spent time in this fandom, and I've seen confident declarations about authentication that were later disputed by other people who also claimed to know what they were talking about. Television footage is not ideal for authenticating luxury goods. Lighting does weird things to colors. Camera angles compress details. I'm not saying all the fan observations are wrong. I'm saying I hold them at maybe 80% confidence rather than 100%, and I think that's the honest position. The father thing, similarly, family financial help is not inherently a story. The story only exists because of the contrast with the image. If Darcy had always presented herself as someone who was figuring it out, who had good days and bad days financially, the mic involvement would read completely differently. The critique is really about the gap between the presentation and the reality, not about the reality itself. And for people who think the whole narrative here is overblown, there's a legitimate case that fans spend too much time picking apart the personal finances of reality TV cast members who didn't sign up to have their bank accounts publicly scrutinized. Darcy signed up to be on a show about relationships. The degree to which her financial situation has become public fodder is partly a consequence of her own choices in how she presents herself, but it's also partly just what happens when you're a woman on reality television. People find a thread and they pull it, and sometimes they pull harder than the actual evidence warrants. I hold that as a real counter-argument. I don't think it's fully convincing given how much of this was aired on the show itself, but it's not nothing. So, where does this land for me? My honest read is that Darcey Silva built a persona that was always slightly ahead of her actual financial situation, and that for a while it worked well enough that it didn't matter. The show gave her a platform, the platform gave her an audience, the audience responded to the image, and the image justified itself. That's a loop that can run for a surprisingly long time before it starts to break down. Where it started breaking down, I think, is when the costs of maintaining the persona started exceeding whatever income the persona was generating. That's a threshold that's hard to identify in real time, and once you've crossed it, it's very hard to walk back publicly without essentially admitting that the whole thing was partially constructed. And Darcy has not shown any particular interest in making that admission. The Georgi relationship, as far as I can read it from the outside, was caught in that same trap. Two people maintaining expensive-looking personas, neither of whom may have had the financial foundation to support those personas long-term, trying to build something together under those conditions. That's genuinely difficult. Money stress is one of the most corrosive forces in any relationship, and when you add the layer of public performance on top of it, where you're supposed to be showing the world a certain kind of life, the pressure compounds in ways that probably aren't healthy for anyone involved. The Mike situation is where I feel the most conflicted, honestly. Because on one hand, a parent helping an adult child financially is just a family dynamic and not inherently anyone's business. On the other hand, when that help is being used to sustain an image that is then being projected publicly to an audience that includes people who are considerably less financially comfortable than the image suggests, there's something uncomfortable about it. I don't think Darcy is trying to deceive people maliciously, but I do think she's caught in a situation where the truth and the presentation have drifted pretty far apart, and the longer that gap persists, the harder it becomes to close it. What I think this is, at its core, is a story about what happens when the identity you've built becomes more expensive than you can afford, literally and figuratively. Darcy put a lot of work into building something. The question of whether what she built is sustainable seems, based on everything we've seen, to have a pretty uncomfortable answer. And watching someone navigate that in public, with the cameras running and the fans watching for inconsistencies in the shoe soles, is genuinely not an easy thing to observe. I don't know how this ends for her. I hope, actually, that she finds a version of herself she can sustain without the props. Because I think the person underneath the Birkins and the red bottoms and the Miami high-rise is more interesting than the persona she's built around them. But that's just my reading. I could be completely wrong about what's underneath. I usually am, about people I only know from television.